The morning Owen Callard got fired, his daughter had just learned to tie her shoes. He knew this because Marisol had called him at 7:42 a.m. Not to tell him anything was wrong, just to tell him that. She was 6 years old and she wanted him to know. She had done it 3 times in a row to make sure it wasn't luck, she said. And her voice had the particular brightness of a child who has discovered that the world will occasionally cooperate with her. He had been standing in the parking lot of Delwood Industrial with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and he had told her he was proud of her, that he would take her to the park when he got home, that she should show Mrs. Ferris next door. Then he had gone inside. By 9:15, he was in a conference room with 2 men he had never spoken to before, and a woman from HR whose name he didn't catch, and they were explaining to him, with the careful blankness of people reading from a script they did not write, that his position had been eliminated, that the company was restructuring, that this was not a reflection of his performance. He sat there for a moment after they finished. The Hartwell line is running a 12mm calibration drift, he said. Has been for 6 weeks. I filed the report. If someone doesn't correct that before the Thursday run. The woman from HR said, "We appreciate your dedication, Owen." He understood then that the meeting was over. Owen had worked at Delwood for 11 years. He had started as a floor technician and worked his way to lead process engineer, which was a title that meant he was the person they called at 2 a.m. when something broke down. He had never been late. He had covered shifts that weren't his and trained people who later outranked him and solved problems that the men above him didn't fully understand, which was perhaps the issue. He had made himself indispensable in ways that were invisible until they weren't, and the men who ran Delwood had recently discovered that invisible things are easy to eliminate on a spreadsheet. He drove home on autopilot. The drive took 22 minutes, and he remembered none of it. Marisol was at school. The house was quiet, in the way that empty houses are, when you aren't supposed to be in them. He made a second cup of coffee he didn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table and looked at a crayon drawing. She had taped to the refrigerator a stick figure in a hard hat standing next to a smaller stick figure with a lopsided ponytail, both of them holding hands. She had labeled the tall one date and the short one ME, and underneath that, in the unsteady capitals of a child still making peace with the alphabet, US. He sat with that for a long time. His wife Renata had died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer which does not negotiate. She had been 34 years old, and she had been the kind of person who left a room feeling different than it did before she entered it, and when she was gone, the room stayed different in the wrong direction. He had learned to be a father in the way that people learn languages by being dropped into countries where no one speaks their own. Clumsily at first, then with growing fluency, then with a kind of love for it he hadn't anticipated. Marisol was the reason he had stayed at Delwood when other offers came. The stability, the health insurance, the predictability of a schedule he could build her life around. Now he sat in the kitchen with none of that and looked at the drawing on the refrigerator and thought about what to tell her. He told her the truth because he had made a decision after Renata died that Marisol would grow up in a house where the truth was spoken plainly, even when it was hard. He said the company didn't need him anymore, but that he was very good at what he did and he would find something new, and in the meantime, things might be a little different, but they would be okay. She thought about this with the seriousness that 6-year-olds bring to important information. Then she said, "Can you come pick me up from school now? Since you're home?" He said yes, he could do that now. The job search was humbling in the specific way that being skilled at something no one is currently hiring for is humbling. Owen had 11 years of floor-level process engineering, the kind of knowledge that lives in the hands and the ears as much as the brain. The sound a correctly calibrated line makes versus one that's running a 1/4 degree hot, the feel of a seal that's going to fail in 3 weeks. That knowledge did not translate easily into the bullet-pointed language of resumes. He sent out 43 applications over 6 weeks, and got 7 responses, 3 of which were automated. He picked up contract work where he could. A manufacturing plant in Garfield needed someone to audit their ventilation system. A small tool and die shop needed a week of equipment assessments. He drove 40 minutes each way to a plastics facility that paid him as a day laborer because the foreman knew his reputation and didn't need the paperwork to know his worth. It kept the lights on. It did not keep much else. Marisol noticed things children aren't supposed to notice. She stopped asking for things. She began eating all of her dinner without being reminded. One evening he found her standing in front of the pantry, doing what appeared to be an inventory, her lips moving slightly, and when he asked what she was doing, she looked at him with her mother's eyes. Renata's particular expression of calm assessment, and said, "Just checking." He made sure she didn't see his face after that. It was the plastics facility, the one in Garfield, where he first encountered the problem. He had been brought in for a standard assessment, the kind of work that should have taken 3 days. On the second day he found it, a structural mounting bracket on the primary extrusion line, 3rd bay, installed with the wrong grade fastener, not close to wrong. Categorically, definitively wrong, the kind of wrong that suggests either catastrophic ignorance or deliberate substitution. The grade they had used would hold fine under normal operating load. Under thermal expansion at production temperatures, with the vibration cycle those machines ran, he gave it 8 months before it failed. When it failed, it would fail into an occupied workspace. He flagged it in his report. He documented it with photographs and specifications. He submitted the report to the facility manager, a man named Dale, who shook his hand and said they'd look into it. He drove home and didn't hear anything. He followed up twice. The second time, Dale told him the bracket had been reviewed by our internal team and was within acceptable parameters. Owen looked at the email for a long time. He was a contract worker. He had no standing. He wrote back with the specific load calculations, the thermal expansion coefficient, the projected failure timeline. He received an out-of-office reply that Dale was traveling for 2 weeks. He let it sit. He should not have let it sit, and he knew it. But he was tired in a way that goes deeper than sleep, and he had a daughter who needed dinner made. 6 weeks later, he got a call from a woman named Judith Crane. She said she was the regional compliance director for Harman Consolidated, the parent company that owned the plastics facility in Garfield. She had come across his report during a quarterly audit. She wanted to ask him some questions. He answered them, honestly and in detail, which was the only way he knew to answer things. 2 days later, she called again. She said they had terminated the facility manager and were replacing the bracket. She also said, if he was open to it, that Harman Consolidated had a position they'd been struggling to fill, an equipment compliance specialist covering 3 facilities in the region. The work was what he already did, but with standing, with authority to act on what he found. He sat in his truck in the parking lot of the tool and die shop in Bridgepoint, where he'd just finished a day of assessments, and looked at his phone for a long moment after she finished talking. "Why are you calling me?" he asked. "I was a contractor. I didn't have any obligation to push that hard." There was a brief pause. "That's exactly why I'm calling," she said. He started the following Monday. Judith Crane was 51 years old, gray-haired, in the way of someone who had decided that gray suited her better than the alternative, and she ran the compliance division with the specific efficiency of a person who had seen too many shortcuts and was no longer interested in watching anyone take them. She had 3 people on her team. Owen became the 4th. The work was good. Not easy. The facilities he covered ranged from adequately maintained to grimly neglected, and he spent the first month writing reports that were essentially love letters to bureaucratic remediation. But it was the kind of work that accumulated into something. The bracket in Garfield was replaced. A coolant line in Delwood, irony being what it is, was reclassified as a priority repair after Owen filed a report that included the phrase, "not if but when," in the executive summary. The facility manager there sent a complaint about the phrasing. Judith forwarded it to Owen with a single comment, "Keep the phrasing." Harmon Consolidated's main office occupied the 14th through 17th floors of a building in downtown Millhaven. Owen worked primarily in the field, which was where he wanted to be, but there were quarterly reviews that required him to come in, and it was at one of these, the second one, in March, that he met Danielle Voss. She was presenting the Q1 compliance metrics to a room of 11 people, and she did it without notes, which he noticed because he had spent enough years in rooms full of people reading from slides to find it remarkable. She was the head of operations analytics, which was a job that apparently involved knowing everything about everything and distilling it into numbers that told a coherent story. She did this with precision and also, somehow, without making the people in the room feel like they were being assessed, which was a skill Owen recognized as genuinely difficult. He didn't speak to her that day. He saw her again 6 weeks later in the parking structure, where she was standing next to a car that had a flat tire and was looking at it with the expression of someone calculating how much this was going to cost her afternoon. He had a kit in his truck. He offered to help. She accepted in the way of someone who is practical enough to recognize that pride about these things is a waste of time. They did not talk much while he worked, which he appreciated. When he finished, she thanked him in a way that was specific and genuine rather than reflexive. "You're Owen Callard," she said. "Judith talks about your reports like they're literature. I try to be specific," she says. "She says you documented a failure cascade in Garfield that the facility team had signed off on 3 separate times. They had a manager who was very confident." She looked at him with a kind of dry attention. Confidence is easy to fake. Calibration is hard. He thought about that on the drive home. They had coffee the following week, which happened in the way of things between adults who are both too busy and too self-aware to pretend the coffee is about something else. It was efficient and comfortable, and they talked about work for 40 minutes, and then about nothing in particular for 20, which felt like the right proportion. He told her about Marisol at some point, because Marisol existed as a fact of his life the same way that gravity does, unavoidably, constantly. He mentioned her age, her current obsession with a particular series of illustrated books about a girl who could talk to horses, her recent and deeply felt conviction that scrambled eggs were better with hot sauce. Danielle listened in the way of someone who is genuinely interested and not simply waiting for their turn. She did not offer performed enthusiasm. She asked whether Marisol had actually tried the horse talking, given she seemed empirical about it. He said she had. She had stood in a field on the way back from his sister's place and spoken very seriously to a brown horse named, according to the fence sign, Chester. Chester had regarded her with enormous indifference. Marisol had concluded that either the gift wasn't universal or Chester specifically lacked the capacity. Danielle laughed at that. The real kind, not the social kind, and he felt something in his chest do something he hadn't felt in a long time and had honestly stopped expecting. They saw each other 5 more times over the next 2 months. He did not call it dating, even in his own head. He did not know what to call it exactly. It was 2 people who liked talking to each other, finding reasons to talk. He had not been in that situation since before Renata's diagnosis, and he had forgotten that it felt like this, the particular lightness of it, the way you think about things differently when someone else is going to hear them. He was thinking about whether to introduce her to Marisol, which was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the largest thing he could imagine, when she said, over dinner at a place neither of them had been before, "My father wants to meet you." He heard the sentence. He processed it. He set his fork down. "He knows about me. I talk to him about things that matter to me." She said this without drama, as simple fact. Owen looked at his plate for a moment. "Who's your father?" she told him. He looked up. Garrett Voss was the founder and chairman emeritus of Harmon Consolidated. He had built the company from a regional manufacturing supplier into a 7-facility operation over 30 years. He had also, in the process, acquired the plastics facility in Garfield sometime around the period when a certain facility manager named Dale had been approving the installation of substandard fasteners on load-bearing brackets. Owen thought about the bracket. He thought about the 8 months he had given it before failure. He thought about the workspace it would have failed into. "Your last name is Voss," he said. "It is. I didn't." He stopped. "I didn't put that together. I know. I didn't hide it, but I didn't volunteer it either, and I noticed you didn't ask about my family." She paused. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you." He was very still for a moment. Not angry, he didn't have the shape of the situation clearly enough yet to know what he felt. Just still. "Does he know who I am?" Owen asked. "Specifically. Not just that you're seeing someone, yes. The Garfield report, yes." Owen looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them looked away. "Okay," he said. "Okay? Okay, I'll meet him." He picked up his fork. "I want to understand something." She waited. "Did you know about Garfield when you introduced yourself to me?" "No," she said. "I knew about you from Judith. I didn't read your reports until after our first coffee. I didn't connect my father's acquisition timeline to Garfield until after that." She held his gaze. "When I did, I should have told you sooner." He thought about whether he believed her. He found that he did, not because it was convenient, but because she was the kind of person whose tells, if they had any, he had paid enough attention to know, and she had none. "All right," he said. Garrett Voss was 73 years old and lived in a house in the Aldenmere neighborhood that was old and expensive in the way of something built to last rather than built to impress. He met Owen at the door himself, which Owen had not expected from a man of his position, and he shook his hand with the directness of someone who understood that the conversation they were about to have required no ceremony. They sat in a study with bookshelves on 3 walls and 2 cups of coffee on the table between them and Danielle, nowhere in the room, which had been her idea, she said, that he could come in alone if he wanted. Garrett Voss looked at him for a long moment and then said, "I want to tell you about Garfield. I want to tell you specifically." Owen said nothing. He listened. Garrett told him that the Garfield acquisition had happened during a period of rapid expansion, that the due diligence had been compressed in ways it should not have been, that the facility manager Dale had been an existing employee who came with the acquisition and whose practices had not been adequately audited, that none of this excused what happened, that the substitute fasteners had been part of a pattern of cost-cutting that Dale had been running for at least 2 years before Owen's report surfaced it, that 3 people had signed inspection reports on that bracket, that Garrett had reviewed every one of those reports himself after the fact. He said it plainly, without the careful language of legal limitation. He said, "We failed, I failed, not our team or the process. I should have audited more carefully." Owen sat with that. "What happened to Dale?" he asked. "Terminated. Referred to the State Occupational Safety Authority." Garrett paused. "There is a civil matter still pending which I cannot discuss in detail, but I want to be clear that it was pursued." Owen nodded. "I want to ask you something," Garrett said, "and you can tell me it's not my business. Go ahead." "You filed that report as a contractor. You had no obligation to push past the initial response. You followed up, twice, with full technical documentation, with a manager who was clearly not going to act on it." He looked at Owen with direct attention. "Why?" Owen thought about Dale's email. He thought about the workspace the bracket would have failed into. He thought about the sound of the line running, which he had stood and listened to for 20 minutes during the assessment, the way experienced equipment has a particular voice, and the way experienced people hear what it's saying. "Because I knew what would happen," he said, "and knowing changes the obligation." Garrett Voss was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Danielle's mother would have said exactly that. She was a nurse for 30 years. Owen looked at him. "She passed," Garrett said, 6 years ago. There was a pause in the room that was not uncomfortable. "I'm sorry," Owen said. "So am I." Garrett picked up his coffee. "She would have liked you." He drove home through the east side of Millhaven with the windows down and the spring air coming in, and thought about what it meant to be liked by people you never got to meet. Marisol was awake when he got home, technically, though she was at the tail end of being awake, which meant she was in bed with a book and losing the battle with gravity at a fairly rapid rate. She looked up when he came in. "How was the man?" she asked. He had told her he was having dinner with someone important, which was both accurate and insufficient. "He was honest," Owen said, "which is harder than it sounds." She thought about this with her book on her chest and her eyes going soft at the edges. "Is his daughter nice?" "She's good at her job. That's not what I asked." He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. She was 7 years old, and she had her mother's face and her mother's particular talent for waiting for the actual answer. "Yes," he said. "She's nice." Marisol appeared to accept this as satisfactory information. She settled deeper into the pillow. He turned off the lamp and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment in the dark. "Dad." "When you meet someone important," she said, with the slow deliberateness of someone whose brain is taking on water, but is trying to get this out before it goes under. "And they're honest even when it's hard. I think that's the kind of person you're supposed to keep." He sat there in the dark after she fell asleep. He thought about 11 years at Delwood, and a bracket in Garfield, and a crayon drawing on a refrigerator. He thought about a woman who had said, "I should have told you sooner," and meant it. He thought about a man who had said, "I failed," when the easier thing was available and chose not to take it. There is a kind of reckoning that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with an apology or a check or a handshake in a room with good lighting. It arrives quietly in the things people do when they think the moment doesn't count. The follow-up sent anyway. The truth told without ceremony. The door opened yourself because you want the conversation to start honestly. Owen had spent 11 years being the kind of person who showed up, who documented things accurately and submitted reports that no one was going to read, and pushed past the easy answer because the harder one was true. He hadn't known that was accumulating into anything. He had just been doing the work. Marisol's breathing was slow and even. The book had fallen to the side. He picked it up, dog-eared her page, set it on the nightstand. He went downstairs and stood in the kitchen and looked at the drawing on the refrigerator. The stick figure in the hard hat, the smaller one with the lopsided ponytail, the careful, unsteady letters, U.S. He had been trying to protect that for 4 years in all the small and exhausting ways that protection requires. He had thought, more than once, that it was only the two of them holding it together, that there wasn't room for anything else, that love was a budget item he had quietly cut. He was beginning to understand that he had been wrong about that, the way you are wrong about things when you make decisions in grief rather than in light. He turned off the kitchen light. He went upstairs. He stopped in the doorway of Marisol's room and listened to her breathe for a moment, which is the thing parents do when they need to remember what the whole thing is for. Then he went to bed, and for the first time in longer than he could precisely name, he fell asleep without the low hum of worry in the background. Some things come back around. Not because the world is fair, it isn't, and anyone who tells you otherwise has not spent enough time in it, but because people who do the work keep showing up, and eventually the right person is in the room to see it. Owen Callard had kept showing up. That was all. That was everything.